Good morning, everybody. There are a lot fewer of you here today, I see. If you're listening to this lecture tomorrow in the comfort of your own home, I don't blame you at all. I don't want to be here this early either. You probably can't hear this on the recording, but your classmates gave me a polite and not entirely believable chuckle. But anyway, those of you who are here, welcome. Good to see you. Thank you for saving me from talking to an empty room. I imagine that would have been a disconcerting experience. Today in our second class together, we will once again not be talking about ViUzka mythology. I promise we will start on the mythology next week. Or this week if you do your reading early. I want you to imagine the ideal site for a classical ViUzka city. And this will give you some idea for why there are only a dozen of them. And I want you to think back to the map of the island from last week. In fact, I want you to think back to it so much that, as you can see, I included it on the slide. What jumps out to you? You, what do you see? Yes, as I mentioned last time, all but one of the cities is on the leeward, slightly less snowy and stormy side of the island, and that other city, Archeology, is an outlier in a lot of ways, and we will be talking about it in a few weeks in some detail, when we discuss the sun and moon, and when we discuss the creation myths of cities. This gives the cities protection from the wind and the intense storms common on the island. And Archeology, while it's on the windward side of the island, is built on a location with a lot of natural shelter. Anything else? You in the back row. Yes, you are the only person in the back row. Give it a stab. Yes, you're right. It's not visible from the map, but yes, as we talked about last week, you need a hot spring or system of hot springs. The beating heart of the ViUzka agriculture and of any ViUzka settlement, classical or modern, is the hot spring. I'm looking for one more thing. This is one thing you can definitely see from the map. Yes, okay, you can stop waving your hand now. That was not the answer I was looking for, but you are absolutely correct. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, all of the cities are in the interior, on the uplands, on the sides of the volcanic mountain chain that runs down the middle of the island. This is because of the location of the island's hot springs. So, one more thing, and please don't be afraid to give the obvious answer. I know you are probably avoiding the obvious answer because you think it's too obvious, but it is the answer I want. You, go ahead. Yes, exactly. All of the cities are close to a river. The river provides a lot of useful things for a city: transport, waste disposal, drinking water, but most of all, it is necessary for the creation of the large, shallow, artificial sabi ponds on which ViUzka agriculture is built. Specifically, the ponds need to be near but below both the hot springs and the river, so that the river from both can flow through the irrigation channels into the pond and mix to become water of the proper temperature. This brings us to another important consideration when building a city. You need soft ground to dig sabi ponds. Most of the island is made up of hard basalt rock, which would have been impenetrable for the classical and pre-classical ViUzka. So all of the cities are located on hillsides with an adequate accumulation of clay to form sabi ponds. The land, however, does not need to be level. In fact, it usually isn't. Most of the cities have terraced ponds going up the hillside. It must have been quite picturesque. The city itself was always built between the hot spring and the river, with the temples, storehouses, and royal residence located in an inner city compound around the spring itself, with the rest of the city spilling out to the banks of the river, or at least to the spring flood banks of the river. Archaeologists used these necessary natural features and local guides to locate the classical era city-states. It is the fact that we have exhausted all of the places on the island with these attributes as well as that we have located all the cities mentioned in the ViUzka records that we have discovered so far, that leads most experts to believe we have located all of the classical ViUzka cities. I know, it does take away some of the romance when there is no more creeping through the wilderness, slashing through the underbrush in search of a lost city. But there is still plenty to discover on the island as archaeologists steadily work to learn more about the sites we have and to locate and dig pre-classical and ViAdmu sites. All of the cities, except Adiki, were ringed with an earthwork embankment and a ditch on 3 sides, with the 4th side being enclosed by the river. There was a further embankment sequestering off the upper city, including the royal residence, the temples, the homes of the city's aristocrats, and most importantly, the hot springs, or at least one of the hot springs. The outer embankments of the city offered protection in times of intercity warfare and from ViAdmu raiders. The inner embankment served to mark out the upper city as sacred space and likely also offered protection in case of armed peasant uprising. Farming villages often resembled miniature cities with an earth embankment surrounding the village and an internal embankment walling off the village chief or lord, depending on the time periods, compound, and the village spring, if it had one, though equally common were villages where the embankment only surrounded the chief or lord's compound. If you're interested in the archaeological side of things, a lot more interesting work currently is being done excavating classical era villages. These embankments could be quite impressive, up to 10 feet tall and 5 feet wide. The buildings within both the villages and the cities were primarily constructed out of wattle and daub, which is a construction method in which posts are connected with woven wicker to make a almost fence or basket-like surface. This is the wattle, and then the surface is coated in mud and clay mixed with plant fiber and often goat dung, the daub, which then dries to create a solid wall. Some temples and royal residences were built out of timber instead. Wattle and daub doesn't survive well in the archaeological record. Most of what archaeologists have been able to locate have been post holes where the large wall posts were set that have since rotted away. It also doesn't last particularly long while in use and has to be frequently rebuilt and repaired, meaning that buildings were frequently adapted to changing styles and use. Incidentally, wattle and daub architecture is still common on the island today, which is how we know that one of the most common traditional styles of decoration is to whitewash the walls with chalk and then paint designs in yellow ochre, which would have mimicked the natural yellowing that would have occurred in buildings nearest the springs from the high sulfur content of the water. Most people would not have lived in their own homes. They would have instead lived in the households of others. These large houses of the aristocracy were typically long and low, with thatched roofs and a single door facing out from the long side. These houses ran parallel to the mountains, and the side with the door was the one that faced away from the mountains. There were no interior dividing walls, and the house was structured around a long hearth, something like a fire pit, in the middle. Outside, across the back, were shelters for ducks, bees, snails, and outside of the cities, goats. Your position in the household, and therefore in society, would have determined where you slept, but no one is quite sure on the specifics. No one writes down the things that everybody just knows. Smaller single-family houses did exist in both cities and in villages, and were set up much like the larger great houses, only on a much smaller scale. In rural villages, these small single-room houses typically had a round hearth in the center, while in cities they typically did not, and instead we have found many examples of portable braziers instead. One very convenient fact about the ViUzka architecture is that we have never found a single rectangular building that wasn't a dwelling, and we have never found a single round circular building that wasn't a temple or a village shrine. And this goes right back to the pre-classical era. Village shrines were small, probably only holding at most 4 or 5 people at a time, and were either meant for private devotionals or as a place to leave offerings. Most houses had a house shrine on a shelf against the east wall. City temples, on the other hand, were much larger and likewise housed offerings of food and goods. In a rural setting, these were often preserved foods that would be taken out of the shrine and eaten on religious occasions, whereas in the cities, these were pretty explicitly taxes that funded the aristocracy. Anyway, who lived in the classical ViUzka cities and what was life like there? Classical ViUzka society, especially within the cities, was highly stratified. Ruling each city, except for Ediki, was a king. Now, classical ViUzka society was deeply patriarchal, but it was matrilineal and matrilocal. It still is, in fact, though in recent decades it has grown far less rigidly patriarchal, and indeed, ViUzka women have even left the island, something that would have been anathema only 50 years ago. My point is, the kings did not inherit the throne from their fathers. They didn't inherit it at all. They were kings by virtue of being married to a semi-divine priestess queen, who claimed descent from the goddess of the city's hot springs, who was herself the daughter of Orami and Mikacha, the goddesses of fresh water and the volcano, and the granddaughter of Inikba and Uzkana, the god of fire and the goddess of earth. These priestess queens had little to no political power, at least officially, but they were of profound symbolic importance. She was a figure of veneration, and it was believed that as the descendant of the goddess of the local spring, that spring would give good water as long as a priestess queen lived within the city. And this also means that while the priestess queen is held in high esteem and has a major public role in the religious life of the city, leading processions and dedications and sacrifices, it would have been completely unthinkable for the priestess queen or any of her female relations in the same divine feminine line to ever leave the city. She represented the very physical place of the city. Her life and the life of her female relatives would have been highly restricted. And indeed, this attitude toward women as fixed and men as movable reaches down the social scale. Women among the lower classes were also seen as somehow part of the land. In fact, one of the things that horrified classical ViUzka writers about the classical Viadmu was not so much that they were nomadic, but that the women were just as nomadic as the men. Women, as inheritors of property, were, in the records at least, often treated as embodiments of the land that happened to be able to talk. This brings me to another point. While the priestess queens owned the city and the spring, others might own farmland in the hinterlands of the city. Within the priestess queen's domain, land rights and ownership could be subdividable. Indeed, village chiefs functioned as miniature kings, married to a smaller scale version of a priestess queen. This is unsurprising, since the priestess queens and their ruling husbands were almost certainly an outgrowth of the village chief and larger farmer model. This could go further down the social scale, all the way to a woman inheriting a single house. But what about women and their families with no property at all? Most people in the ViUzka city system were poor and did not have property, and worked in the households of other people. This could mean working in the household of a propertied sister, or laboring on the farm of someone unrelated to you. But either way, without property, marriage was impossible, though children were often stillborn, to take up their mother's place on the bottom rung of the social ladder. But what if an unmarried man somehow got his hands on land, or a house that he wished to leave to his children? What if he had no sisters and inherited the land from his parents? What was he to do? Well, he could buy and then free an enslaved woman, which is to say a woman without any lineage, and then marry her and graft her into his own lineage. From there on, his daughters would inherit from him as usual. This could even happen in the lineages of the priestess queens, though it was considered a horrible omen. If the family of Priestess Queens ran out of daughters, a son might become the lineage's conduit by marrying an enslaved woman. In these situations, there would be a lot more ritual involved than in an ordinary union of this type in order to take on some of the Priestess Queen's priestly function. Her new husband would publicly present her to the spring and ask that his divine ancestor bless his wife and take her as a daughter. Weeks of ritual might be involved to purify the city and atone for whatever caused this calamity. We don't have any records of any city's Priestess Queen line entirely dying out until after contact with the outside world brought smallpox, though it is possible it happened and was hushed up or a fake heir installed. Indeed, 4 of the cities still have intact lineages of Priestess Queens who regularly accompany archaeological teams to their cities to lend their support. And about 15 years ago, the daughter of one of these families, from Hropaki, I believe, left to study medicine in Argentina. And it was something of a scandal. But slave marriages brings us to slavery. Yes, slavery absolutely existed in the classical ViUzka world, and we have some evidence for it before the classical period as well. There were 3 main ways to become a slave. The first is if you were abandoned as an infant and then picked up by someone else, you would grow up as that person's slave. The second was as a punishment for certain crimes. If you were a thief, for example, you might be given to your victim as a slave and either sold off or kept to pay for the theft. The last was war captivity. This came in 2 flavors. 2 cities might go to war against each other, or one city might target a ViUzka group. But either way, if your people lost, you were liable to be taken off as a slave. You'll notice that I did not mention being born into slavery. As best we can tell, slave status was not inherited. But since slaves had no property or lineage, the child of an enslaved woman had little hope of rising beyond laboring in someone else's household. Indeed, the lives of slaves and the lives of unpropertied laborers were, at least as far as we can tell, virtually identical, with the only difference being that enslaved people couldn't leave to try to find work elsewhere and that they could be sold. I mentioned that ViUzka might be captured and taken as slaves, and in fact, part of the reason we know this is that a ViUzka woman did marry the son of one of those daughterless priestess queen lineages. But what I didn't mention is that the flow went the other way too. The landless and propertyless laboring classes were the ones most likely to run off and try their hands at being ViUzka. It's easy to talk about the classical ViUzka and ViUzka as 2 distinct cultural groups, but there was a lot of interchange between them, and there were distinct cultural differences, yes, but also a great deal of commonality. So we have talked about the top of society and the bottom of society. It's time to talk about the middle levels. First up, you have your landed farmers and village chiefs. These are not synonyms. In fact, you will often see village chiefs referred to as village or rural lords, and for good reason. They were part of an interconnected and inherited aristocracy, located on the outskirts of cities close enough to make use of the city's spring system, but far enough away that living within the city and commuting to work would not be feasible. Villages were under the control of the husband of a woman who owned, or perhaps embodied as priestess, all or most of the village farmland. You can think of these village lords and their priestess wives as miniature kings and priestess queens. Or, more accurately, you can think of kings and priestess queens as overgrown village chiefs and their wives. Indeed, some of these villages did not draw their water from the city's hot spring. Some of them drew from naturally cooler hot springs that did not need the kind of management that the city springs did, and the chief's wife of these villages was often a semi-divine descendant of the local spring goddess herself. This would have caused a natural tension with the city leadership. The village would be centered around the household of the village chief and his priestess wife, which would consist of themselves, their children, and any relatives living with them, and their laborers and slaves. This might contain most of the village's population. The rest of the village would consist of smaller landed farmers and their households, and any artisans who might, for whatever reason, decide to make their living in the village rather than in the city. The landed farmers, especially in a village with its own spring, would be beholden to the village chief, either for the use of the spring water or for the use of the canals that flowed into the village, and would either owe labor or goods to them, if not both. Indeed, it's not hard to see the ways in which this village social structure, grew into the city social structure. These small villages were probably nearly identical to the villages of their pre-classical forebears. And indeed, throughout the classical period, the majority of people continued to live in villages rather than in the cities proper, with the real changes being that their villages were part of a city-state, and that for the most part they relied on the river and city hot spring system to create artificial sabi ponds rather than using natural sabi hot springs. That could be a more substantial change than is at first apparent, because it meant that these farming villages would have been able to be much closer together physically and to produce a substantial surplus that could then be traded for city goods. It also meant that they owed labor to the organized construction and maintenance of the canals that supplied the city-state's sabi ponds, which could be a pretty hefty chunk of time over the year. But overall, there would have been a great deal of continuity in the agricultural hinterlands with this much older period. And speaking of city goods, let's move on to the lower and middle classes in the cities. On the outer edges of cities, there were yet more farmers who farmed ponds closer to the cities and whose lives would have looked something like those of the smaller landed farmers living under a village chief, though they would have more access to city goods and markets and might have had more city attitude. Next up, you have artisans and merchants who would not have been directly working the land, but would have instead traded their goods for food. The artisans would have included carpenters, builders, stone tool manufacturers, potters, and cook shop owners, weavers, second-hand dealers, among many others. There is a lot of debate within the archaeological community as to whether these cook shop owners actually made food to sell, or whether they charged for other people to use their ovens or stoves, or some combination. Certainly there is little evidence of food manufacture within the city houses, and most people appear to have heated rooms with portable braziers rather than proper hearths. The ViUzka would have bought these goods with weights of sabi flour or with pickled sabi with standardized weights functioning as a currency. These farmers and tradespeople would each have had laborers within their household as well. Next up the social ladder from the farmers and tradespeople came the scribes, bureaucrats, and warriors. These were not separate jobs, by the way. Scribes, bureaucrats, and warriors were the same people. One person did all three. Here is where the priestly class starts to emerge. If you are here, you are already part of a privileged social elite. You are inherited nobility. Your mother would be a priestess, either of the village landed variety or of a city temple, and you would be expected to marry a priestess. You would have spent your entire childhood and into your teens and early 20s getting an education that included writing, literature, history, and mathematics, and also the warrior arts. And then you marry a priestess, and depending on your wife, either become the chief of a village or take up a place within the bureaucracy. The bureaucrats, and in wartime, they, as well as the village nobles, village chiefs, or lords, would be the warriors and effectively the officers of the army. So, in essence, they were the still bureaucrats, but now with a great big stone axe with which to clobber their enemies' skulls. Must have been fun. So these city aristocrats and the country aristocrats were functionally the same class and heavily admixed. Most city aristocrats would have had brothers, fathers, uncles who were country landowners. The country aristocrats only had so much land to go around, and there was a strong preference for keeping an estate intact, granting it all to a single daughter, with her sisters marrying members of their sister's household. So there was a strong impetus to send country noble boys to the city to study and find priestess wives. The city aristocracy was, at least from the records we have, which is, let's remember, mostly written by city aristocrats, appears to have been more prestigious than the country aristocracy, both because there were fewer of them, almost certainly fewer than 100 men, next to 300 or 400 in the country nobility of a given city, and because there was more opportunity for advancement and to even reach the king's inner circle, from which he might choose a husband for his daughters and thus an heir. While men easily moved between the country and the city aristocracy, women did not. Once again, women were fixed and men are mobile. A country noblewoman would remain with her mother and her family, and so would a city noble. So while there does seem to be a standard curriculum for noble boys, women's education was much more localized and showed much more variation. We have some evidence that some very, very high-ranking women, the main priestess of a temple, for example, learned to write, though that was much rarer for women than it was for men, for whom it was already restricted to the aristocracy. So what did aristocratic women learn? This would be the most interesting and pertinent to this course, since as priestesses, they would have had the most to do with worshiping the gods we are learning about. So, of course, frustratingly little of it is written down, though tantalizing details have been preserved in oral history. Aristocratic priestesses appear to have had a fairly rigorous education in the rituals and stories associated with religion and in the public rituals of court life. Some written records indicate that they had highly trained memories and extensive repertoires of memorized songs, poems, hymns, chants, prayers, and the like, all of which any student of ViUzka mythology would kill to have access to. However, with few exceptions, one of which we will be talking about next week, we don't have any of it, both because it wasn't written down and because it was held as secret to the priestly women's class. In a society with a sharp divide between the cities and between the villages, how did country priestesses acquire this extensive education? Often they did not, or acquired it solely from the women within their own family. This is part of the reason there is so much variety within the myths and folklore we have today. It was primarily held to be the domain of women, and women were not portable, with one exception: enslaved women. It is sometimes possible to acquire the enslaved women who had served the city priestesses. In fact, if a city nobleman married into a village family, part of the dowry he brought might include such women. Since enslaved women had no lineage, they could be transported, and with them, the knowledge they picked up in the city. We know this because we have some actually quite nasty caricatures of country noble women fawning over an enslaved woman from the city for her supposed sophisticated knowledge, when before being enslaved, she was really just a dirty peasant thief. Keep in mind these caricatures would be made by aristocratic men. So, as I mentioned previously, one of the perks of marrying into the city nobility was a greater opportunity for advancement, and even being tapped by the king to marry his daughter. This is how succession was supposed to take place. The king picked a likely person from among his nobility to marry his daughter and become king after him. Or he traded sons with the king of another city, usually when those sons were still young children. This was the ideal, but of course reality does not often live up to our ideals. But the ViUzka system, by which women inherited and men took power through marriage to them, gave the political structure a great deal of flexibility. In times of war and conquest, or in the event of a successful coup, the dynasty didn't need to be overthrown. All a conqueror or usurper had to do was kill the previous king and marry the priestess queen. This gave him all the legitimacy he needed. And on that cheerful note, does anyone have any questions on today's lecture? Okay, you first, the one who mentioned all the cities were in the interior. I promise I will learn your names eventually. Probably right after I grade your first papers. Oh yes, I always forget to mention that in the first lecture. but it is in your syllabus. Papers and tests are each worth 25% of your grade. I drop the lowest score, and I offer a makeup paper so you can drop the next lowest score if you fail too. But if both the fails are tests, we will be having a talk about the university's resources for building test-taking skills. Okay, you in the back, who I had to drag kicking and screaming into answering earlier. The question was, why, if the ViUzka could develop this complex social structure, they never left the Stone Age? That is a loaded question. The idea of the Stone Age in many people's minds is full of implications of unsophistication and cavemen, and people who were not yet fully human. This is, of course, hogwash. It also ties into a persistent idea that we inherited all the way back in the 1800s that says that societies progress along a standard developmental path, from most primitive all the way up to the peak of civilization, clearly the 1800s Western world. Different societies were at different stages of development, and if people in those societies were capable of it, this being the era of race science, they would eventually progress to the next stage. This is also not the way the world works, and has long been abandoned by anthropologists, but it has hung on in the popular consciousness. Get it out of your heads. Not just for this class, but in general. Forget it. It is bullshit. And not true of any society, not even the supposed model of Europe. For example, iron began to be used following the Bronze Age collapse, and this is a technological progress. But at the same time, societies became much less complex and urban, and the Greeks outright lost their written language and had to develop a new one several centuries later. No society takes a linear path from less to more developed. The specific answer as to why the classical ViUzka never developed metallurgy is that the island is very poor in mineral deposits, and you can't develop technology for which you lack the raw materials. So, depending on the perspective you decide to take, the classical ViUzka were a complex urban society with a strict social hierarchy in which religious bureaucrats used their own written language to maintain the high degree of cooperation needed to engage in an intricate and unique style of agriculture, and through this controlled the populace, or they were a bunch of Stone Age people living in mud huts. Both are true. Anyway, class dismissed. Your reading for next week is the first chapter of my book, the one going over the creation of the world, which is what we will be discussing next time. At long last, we will be diving headfirst into ViUzka myth.
Hello everyone, I'm Anna Fisher. ViUzka Island, its people, Ubridge University, and my alter ego, Professor Ann Fisher, are all entirely fictitious. I don't have my PhD, and I am not a professor. This video series is meant solely for entertainment, and I hope you were entertained. I hope you enjoyed it, and that if you did, that you would consider leaving a like or a comment, or even subscribing to my YouTube channel and hitting that little notification bell. Social media links are in the description below, and I hope you had a lovely day so far, and if it hasn't been lovely so far, I hope it gets better. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.